The notion of using surgery to address chronic mental health concerns can conjure up some pretty frightening images of days gone by when practitioners would use crude methods to remove or alter parts of people's brains. But new technology and techniques have allowed surgeons the opportunity to more precisely target areas thought to play a role in conditions such as OCD. But is it safe, or any less worrisome than the lobotomies of the past? I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post health reporter Sharon Kirkey joins me to discuss the history of psychosurgery, how new technologies have brought new approaches, and whether the same ethical dilemmas remain. Don't forget, you can find this podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, or tell your friends about the show. So Sharon, you recently wrote a feature about a medical practice that I think a lot of Canadians are unfamiliar with and shines a light on, I guess, I don't know if I want to say a darker side of medicine, but I think some people may see it that way. So for starters, on the basic level, what's known as psychosurgery?
Psychosurgery is essentially brain surgery for psychiatric disorders, for mental illnesses. So it's operating on the brain with the goal of reducing symptoms of really severe, mental illness. It's considered a treatment of really last resort for people with disorders like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and major depression. And these are people who, haven't really responded to the standard treatments. They've tried different medications, different combinations of medications, different forms of therapy, and really nothing has helped them. So these are people known as treatment resistant or treatment refractory OCD or depression. There's different types of psychosurgery. The most common involves kind of burning or making these lesions in the brain, or stimulating specific areas of the brain with the sort of intent to disrupt these brain circuits or pathways that doctors believe are thought to be involved in disorders like OCD or depression. So it's kind of using surgery to go after sort of defective or misfiring brain circuits that are believed to drive things like obsessive compulsive disorder, the obsessive thoughts, and then the compulsive acts to deal with those as obsessive thoughts.
What is it about the surgery that, I guess for even I'm kind of having a hard time grasping, but I am no brain surgeon. What is it about the act of kind of stimulating and then burning away these areas of the brain that actually treats these conditions? Like what is the mechanism by which this is effective?
Yeah, it's really hard to know for sure and difficult to explain, but essentially the belief is that there's, this brain-centric approach to mental illness is this theory that mental disorders are driven by a lot of factors, genetics, the environmental factors, trauma that people were exposed to. But there's this belief that there actually is something physically wrong or going wrong in the brain that can be targeted with these, what they call direct to brain interventions. So actually going into the brain and kind of messing around with specific areas of the brain that, in OCD, what they're doing is they think they're interfering with this kind of loop, this circuit in the brain that kind of feeds these obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. It's about trying to sort of either destroy or kind of, in effect, rewire parts of the brain that are thought to be not working properly, abnormal, in the hopes that, by doing that, you're reducing symptoms. And then perhaps what you're doing is you're interfering with whatever it is in the brain that's making these people not able to respond to more standard treatments like, antipsychotics or antidepressants.
And it sounds a little different than, I guess a lot different than historical practices in this field. Like, when was the idea of using physical medical techniques to treat psychiatric conditions developed, and what was the practice historically?
It's really interesting because it really dates back to ancient times. I mean, archaeologists have discovered or unearthed skulls from the medieval period that had signs of what's called trepanation, which is basically holes that were cut or somehow drilled into the scalp. And they did that to either relieve pressure in the head from, say, a fractured skull, or they did it to treat epilepsy. Sometimes these trepanations were done for kind of the spiritual therapy to release what they thought were evil spirits residing in the brain that were making people behave oddly. But psychosurgery really came into practice in the mid 1930s. It was first introduced by a Portuguese neurologist who actually won a Nobel Prize for his work in this area. So he performed this procedure that he called a prefrontal lobotomy, which was sort of the precursor to the lobotomy. And it's really interesting because there's a Canadian connection here, because this Portuguese neurologist, Monitz, he used an instrument called a leucotome. And what it is, it's this kind of needle-like instrument that had this retractable wire loop at the bottom. And so when he inserted this device into the skull he'd drill 2 holes into the skull, then insert the leucotome, and then he'd kind of scoop out cores of white matter, kind of like coring an apple. And he believed that the frontal lobes of the brain, behind our forehead, that was the site of what he called this pathological psychic activity. And that needed to be disconnected or separated from the rest of the brain to cure things like schizophrenia or psychosis, or even, criminal behavior. They were doing this on criminals. Again, remember, this was a time before there were any antipsychotic drugs or any antidepressants. And, people were shut away in asylums, essentially, with very little to do, very little available to treat these really severe cases. But it was this American neurologist named Walter Freeman who really modified the approach. Freeman, he wasn't a surgeon, and he wanted kind of a faster and an easier way into the brain that, didn't require an operating room, didn't require a surgeon or even a drill. I mean, he himself didn't even wear gloves or gowns. He did nothing. One writer described how Freeman had kind of this disdain for what he called all that germ crap. So he didn't believe in any kind of sterilized field or anything to protect the patient from any kind of infections. Anyway, Freeman went into the brain a different way. He went in through the eye orbit, so the bones around the eye, and he used an instrument that looked a lot like an ice pick. And so that's where we get that phrase, the so-called ice pick lobotomies. So what he would do, he'd give people a couple of electric shocks to kind of sedate them, make them not quite unconscious, and then, peel back the eyelids, hammer the ice pick through the bone, the orbital bone, and then kind of wiggle it around to destroy tracts or circuits in the brain tissue, and those circuits that he thought were responsible for symptoms of mental illness. So very, very crude. And he was a real crusader, lobotomy crusader. He did thousands of these, and he did them in bizarre places, hallways of hospitals, even barns sometimes. It was pretty crazy.
We'll be right back. So you talk about it being a crude practice, the particular practitioner not very concerned about germs and things like that. Looking at it more broadly, I guess, was it deemed an effective practice? Was it deemed dangerous? Were there, mishaps over the years? And how widespread was the practice of lobotomies?
It's interesting because some patients did benefit. It was meant for, severe mental illness. some people did benefit, but the problem was Freeman wasn't discriminating. He operated on thousands of people, and other people who he trained operated on many people. He operated on kids as young as 4, and he operated on a lot of women. Most of the women, many of the people who had lobotomies from the 1940s through the mid 50s were women. And these were women whose husbands saw their wives as sort of these hysterical nuisances. He was by a lot of accounts, very arrogant and egotistical and a real showman, kind of like a carny at a county fair. But, it did benefit some people. But the problem was, in many cases, it also caused these radical personality changes. People had seizures. There was dementia like memory impairment. Historians have described people who became, almost zombie-like. And I think about 15% experienced either a brain hemorrhage or they died. So, it certainly was not risk-free. And how widespread was it? Well, I think it was about 30,000 were performed in the US alone. They were also performed in Canada, in Toronto, Montreal. There were major lobotomy programs. It wasn't just, the asylums hidden in the countryside that were doing this. There were major lobotomy programs at some private hospitals in the US. There were lobotomy programs at Yale and Columbia University. So it was, I don't think it was never common practice. I think it was still reserved for what they considered the most intractable or those treatment-resistant cases. But there were tens of thousands of them done over the years.
And as we know, just living through the last half century, the practice of lobotomies started to wane at some point, correct? I'm curious when it happened and what led to it. Was it concerns about the practice in itself, or were there better treatments developed for mental illness?
Yeah, there were hints. The problem is this was at a time where we didn't have the internet. So there wasn't a lot of rapid sharing of medical information, right? So there wasn't a lot of, people weren't really aware of what the outcomes were because it took longer to either report them, or in some cases they didn't report them. But also around the mid-1950s, that's when the first antipsychotics came on the market. And, a lot of people then thought antipsychotics were going to be a panacea, right? They were going to be what cured people, especially people with severe illness. The problem is, for a significant number of people, they didn't help, and they still don't help. So, and then the antipsychotics were followed by antidepressants. And antidepressants today are, among the most prescribed drugs in Canada. When I looked at the figures, I think for 2023, it was like over 2 billion of tablets of antidepressants were dispensed by drugstores in Canada in 2023, which, really, when you think of it, is an astonishing number. So it was, there's a shift away from direct to brain interventions, these brain surgeries, to more of a pharmacological or drug approach to treating mental illness that really kind of, pushed psychosurgeries not completely away, but fewer and fewer of them were done. But they never ever stopped being performed.
But as you write in your piece, it seems to be that they're growing in, I don't want to say popularity, but they are becoming more common again. I'm curious, was it new technologies, new evidence in brain science, or a belief that the pharmacological approach doesn't work for some people? Like, what led to the revival here?
I think it was a combination of two things, as it was explained to me. Mostly it's down to advances in brain imaging, that lets doctors kind of map the human brain in 3 dimensions. So that they could better look at what parts of the brain they were targeting, and then tools that let them reach those targets with, really millimeter scale precision. So, really more refined surgical tools, more refined imaging, and, less what they call invasive ways into the brain, right? So you don't need to now, drill into the brain or open the brain, open the cranium. You can get access to the brain in different ways, including ultrasound, focused ultrasound, which is what I focused on in the piece you're talking about. And also, I think a deeper understanding of the brain and how it functions has sort of led to this revival, looking at how we can, get to some of these targets, perhaps more effectively than what effect the drugs have on the brain.
Does the practice still have a reputation as being an inexact science or ineffective or potentially dangerous, like a practice like a lobotomy would? Are there still concerns about the ethics or the efficacy of psychosurgery?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even the people leading these experiments, and these are still experimental procedures in many cases, they'll be the first to tell you the whole field of psychosurgery still lives under this very dark cloud because of its history, the word lobotomy for a lot of us conjures up images of Jack Nicholson and, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and critics, and there are plenty of them, they say, it's impossible to point to, a specific clump of neurons or a specific circuit in the brain and say, there, that's where the problem is, and let's go in and fix it. Because, mental illness is so complex, right? It's not just about misfiring brain circuits. There's so many other factors that feed into this. And anything that irreversibly, alters the brain is considered pretty risky and dangerous, even by many psychiatrists. There was a survey done of psychiatrists and psychiatric interns at McGill not long ago, and I think it was like at least a third of them said we shouldn't be doing this. It's still too dangerous. We still really don't know, what we're doing, and concerns have been raised by some leading neuroethicists, so ethicists who are experts in the field of these kind of brain interventions, who worry about, aside from the physical risk that so far they haven't been reported for, some of these procedures seem to be safe and with none of the horrible side effects that we saw with Freeman's lobotomies. But there's still this concern about, well, what might it do to a person's personality, right? Their true self. And, I try not to read the comments a lot on the pieces I write because they tend to be kind of depressing. But one comment posted to the story, a reader asked, haven't we messed with people's brains enough? So there's a lot of skepticism and caution for sure, which I think is good and healthy because we need to avoid those harms of the past.
What about the patients who have undergone these still experimental procedures? What do they say about how it's affected their lives or impacted them?
Well, I spoke to a couple of them, and it was interesting because they both were suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder. And they underwent this procedure called MR-guided focused ultrasound, which basically uses ultrasound waves to burn away brain tissue, like small pieces. Well, small pieces is relative, but pieces of brain tissue about 10 millimeters in size, or centimeters. But they said that, it wasn't instantly that they felt different, but gradually over 6 months and out to a year, the symptoms did subside. They could feel that something was different. I guess the trouble is that we really don't have a lot of data, right? We have very small trials so far involving very small number of patients. And deep brain stimulation is one that people might be more familiar with, right? Where they go, this is a form of psychosurgery where they go in with electrodes to put the electrodes in the brain, and those electrodes stimulate certain areas of the brain. But deep brain stimulation really hasn't lived up to its earlier hype. When they actually tested it in what they call sham-controlled experiments, so they take some patients, everybody gets the electrodes, but only in some of them are the electrodes actually switched on. And in those sham-controlled experiments, deep brain stimulation hasn't really shown any significant improvement in symptoms compared to people where the electrodes weren't turned on. And other, focused ultrasound hasn't been tested in those sham-controlled experiments. But, in fairness, there was a pretty thorough analysis done for Ontario's Health Ministry, which is right now considering providing at least, one-time funding to have about 100 people have this focused ultrasound approach. That review found that, so far it seems safe. There's no serious side effects, and that, people have reported meaningful improvements in their symptoms.
Well, it sounds like A, fascinating research, but B, a story that could provide positive impacts for a lot of people suffering pretty intractable mental illness, but I suppose caution is warranted. Sharon, thanks for your time.
Oh, my pleasure, Dave.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest Sharon Kirkey. More from her at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.